Our next speaker is Dr. Rajakishore Nath. He's a professor of philosophy at IIT Bombay, specializing in artificial intelligence, philosophy of mind, and cognitive science. He published many peer-reviewed papers, and he's also on the advisory board for AI, artificial intelligence, and society, knowledge, culture, and communication by stranger. Now, Dr. Rajakishore Nath, he's going to talk about, and his topic is the problem of embodied consciousness in the lens of Vedantic view of consciousness. May I request to Dr. Rajakishore Nath, please, you can start your presentation.
Yeah. Respected Puri Maharaj and respected Santha Maharaj, respected Muni Maharaj, and respected Krishna Kesava Das Maharaj. Thank you very much for your invitation to the 11th International Conference on Science and Scientists. The talk is on life and cognitions at the intersection of science, philosophy, and religion. I would like to talk on the problem of embodied consciousness in the lens of Vedantic view of consciousness. I was asked by uh, Krishna Maharaj to talk on embodied cognitions, but I said I can talk on embodied consciousness from the Vedantic perspective. The idea of embodied cognitions can be go back to the Cartesian embodied theory of mind. Rene Descartes, he spoke in the 17th century about this idea, and he talk about disembodied theory of mind, mind without the body, and this embodied cognitions talk about uh, cognitions with body, and therefore uh, this disembodied thesis is a kind of idea where it talk about the mind is entirely distinct from the body and can be successfully explained and understood without referring to the body. You see, therefore, it's not necessary that the body is the essential criteria to talk about this kind of things. Although this idea has been mostly spoken by many other uh, philosophers later on, like um, continental philosopher Merleau-Ponty and others who spoke about the phenomenology of perceptions, and they talk about how our cognitive ideas very much are related to each other, and all these ideas uh, stands in comparison to many other things. But this theory of consciousness, especially embodied aspect of consciousness, have offered kind of a causal explanations to consciousness, that is called and how and what of consciousness, how the we are our cognitive faculties has been functioning, and how we are doing the activities in that way it has been working. And the supporter of this thesis or this theory have argued that they have every reason to believe that uh, the causal explanation of consciousness are very much integrations with the state of organism with the environment. That is to say that the human consciousness depends on the bodily gesture around the world. This kind of explanation is based on the ground that consciousness is causally dependent on the material universe. That of all consciousness phenomena can be explained by mapping the physical universe. In this regard, consciousness is basically kind of a bodily phenomenon and can be causally explained following by the naturalistic method of science. It is easy to talk about the causal explanation of consciousness. That is to say that the embodied consciousness is necessarily embodied in living organisms. One of the important strong claim is that any physical organism that is capable of carrying our causal processes can be meaningfully consciousness because it performs important tasks of living beings. But it is hard to believe that a body can give rise consciousness because there is no conscious effort in the body. That is, there is no subjective experience of the body. But there are many philosophers like Mark Rowlands, and who has written in his book about this idea that the body you see in the mirror, the hands that you hold off in front of you, are instance of the body as an object. But the body is more than the object. That is to say that there is also the body as a subject, the body as a living body. It's a lived body. You cannot say the lived body by looking in the mirror. The body is living by in the virtue of what you which we see the body as object. Therefore, there is no question concern whether consciousness is embodied in the living body or consciousness lived in the body. There can be there are one and the same thing, the body as object, not trace of the consciousness. Therefore, this kind of idea which you will find uh, in the case of this um, uh, uh, Marx explanations. But now we face many kind of possible questions, which how can the unintelligent body gives rise consciousness? How can this kind of things possible? Because this idea is very difficult to explain. Because this idea, if you see, is a completely this body has become the subject. Again, the body is going to be instrumental, and it's a kind of a instrumentalistic idea about this kind of explanation about the consciousness. And this instrumental consciousness gives rise some kind of a mechanistic thesis of explanation, and this thesis has been mostly spoken by recently the great philosopher like Daniel C. Dennett, and who spoke about that there is a kind of a uh, even if our beliefs, our desires, our intentional factors, and all these can be explainable from the instrumental levels. And there are other philosophers like John Saul and David Chalmers. They have given some kind of a naturalistic explanation about this consciousness. Therefore, this kind of there is some kind of a so you see there is some kind of a clue, or there is some kind of a mm, there is some kind of a uh, some kind of a reductionism is going on within the naturalistic framework, and this kind of reductionism is very difficult to to explain the consciousness, because and these explanations are kind of embodied, because when we talk about embodied consciousness, we talk about the conscious experience about yourself as well as about the environment, which there is some kind of a inactivism also going on within that, and that inactivism gives rise some kind of a, a, conscious experience. But the conscious experience itself is something different, because you cannot say that consciousness is a kind of a body, that the body plays very vital role. You see how the body will talk about this kind of idea, that therefore this kind of idea very difficult to um, am I audible? Hello, am I audible?
Yes, yes, we are able to hear.
Yeah, yeah. Thank
Yes,
you very
you're
much.
audible.
Yeah, because there is some problem in the internet this side.
No,
That's
we can hear you properly.
yeah. Thank you very much. Yeah. This because whenever you call the subject is here the I. and I plays very vital role to explain the conscious subject, you see. And I, which treated as a subjective consciousness. That is why consciousness is defined in terms of a qualitative feel of experience. You see, that's qualitative feel of experience, and that qualitative experience you will not find in the case of any other uh, bodily kind of, or any kind of biological, or any kind of a naturalistic explanation. Although there are philosophers like, as I told you, John Saul and David Chalmers, they try to give some kind of a biological explanations about this consciousness, or one day the biology can able to talk about consciousness. But these kind of consciousness, whatever they have been talking about, is a kind of embodied consciousness. And this embodied consciousness, and whenever we talk about embodied, on which are within the purview of this naturalistic thesis of consciousness. But the problem arises here is that this uh, and this embodied consciousness, whenever we see, as if we as if some kind of a uh, access, this embodied consciousness talk about some kind of idea about access consciousness, whatever we have been accessing in this world. And this access consciousness is a kind of a thesis, and which you will find in the uh, uh, in this thesis. Therefore, this access consciousness, where we can access the human behavior, or human cognitions, and these cognitions talk about many kind of ideas and many kind of things. Uh, 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 Therefore, this embodied consciousness uh, is a kind of which I was telling you, that there is kind of access consciousness, and this access consciousness establish uh, some kind of a reductive, or some kind of a third person's perspective, which another person's, or any kind of third person perspective, or any kind of reductive perspectives, a kind of a kind of a kind of a causal explanation about this consciousness. Uh, but these causal explanations cannot explain, even if as I even if there is some kind of called phenomenal consciousness that plays very vital role, and that's phenomenal consciousness, and which is more real and than this third person perspective. And this third person perspective, which is based on the method of science, or which is a kind of a naturalistic in character. And therefore science uh, treat this consciousness uh, science treats this consciousness is a kind of a natural phenomena. If the world is taken as a closed system, then the consciousness itself must be placed in the bound to physical laws. And but if it is the case, then the question is that, is consciousness a natural phenomena? But it is not the case. It is very difficult to avoid the because this phenomenal experience, and and that kind of a consciousness, and that consciousness which gives kind of a um, uh, uh, kind of deep insight into our conscious experience. But this kind of conscious experience, whatever we see, the fundamental theory of consciousness, and which is completely physiological, or some kind of material, or some kind of a in, introvertive uh, way, some kind of way they have been talking. But the consciousness is, we may say that it is not a mystery, you see. Because if it is a mystery, it is then mystery is something which we cannot know, we cannot explain. Mystery does not mean that something is a mystery because we are not able to explain in the scientific way or in the causal way. That doesn't mean that it is a mystery, but it is beyond from that. And therefore this beyond is gives some kind of pure consciousness, and which we find in the Advaita Vedanta especially, and Advaita theory of consciousness. This Advaita theory of consciousness mostly uh, explicitly borrowed from the Manduka Upanishad, and Manduka Upanishad plays a vital role to talk about consciousness. The Advaitins are proposing the concept of Brahman and the Atman, that are the absolute, are the source of all form of consciousness and the world. You see, they are the source of all the consciousness and the world. Like whenever I see the my visual field and my visual system, there is a difference between my visual what I see, but my my visual system is not part of my visual field, you see, and therefore it is like this. Therefore it is my visual system is the source of my visual field, you see. Therefore they cannot be, both the things cannot be one actually. Therefore there exists perfectly identity between Brahman and Atman. The pure consciousness Atman cannot be known as the object of mediate knowledge, you see. Atman cannot be known as the mediate, some kind of other way. Causal explanation is not possible. It is involved in the act, every act of knowing, that when we know that kind of thing, that plays a vital role. The nature of consciousness here is, I would like to use this word, is a kind of transcendental, you see. It is a transcendental consciousness must be independent of worldly causality, you see. If it is causal, if it is worldly causality, then it is a deterministic, then it is explainable, you see. But there are many scientific inquiries. They have been explaining consciousness differently. Cognitive psychologists are explaining differently. AI scientists, they are explaining differently. Neuroscientists, they are explaining differently. There are kind of different kind of causal explanations. And in philosophy, we need some kind of a holistic explanation. That holistic explanation you will find in the case of a Vedantic approach towards consciousness. The transcendental consciousness must be independent of world causality. That is to say that a transcendental account of consciousness regard consciousness without locus and without object, the condition of possibility of manifestation of anything whatsoever. However, this transcendental approach to consciousness does not treat consciousness as an object. Rather, it takes consciousness to be self manifesting. If this is the fact, then consciousness cannot be caused, cannot be causal. On the other hand, the Vishistadvaita claims that consciousness is a quality of the self, which is actively intentional and always changing. You see, on the other hand, Vishistadvaita, who they the quality is the quality of the self, and which is active and which is always uh, uh, always some kind of uh, change is there. You see, but this kind of things is not applicable in the case of uh, Advaita Vedantins, because for Advaita Vedantin, this kind of idea is very much, it's a kind of self-illuminating and self-reflecting. You see, it reflects itself. You see, and therefore, and the further to say that the self is eternal as essential consciousness, which we studied the theory of consciousness, and they talk about the relationship between consciousness and the self. You see, which is dismissed from the Advaitic perspective as contradictory because of the fact that Advaitin assumes that a substance must be either completely identical with or different from its attributes. Brahman cannot be both substance as well as attributes. If you apply this kind of ideas in the case of causal explanations, both the things, both attributes as well as substance as well as attributes, you see both the kind of things you will find, like in the case of causal explanations of intentionality, causal explanation, beliefs, and this kind of things, where they claim that consciousness itself is like this actually. Even if consciousness is a kind of macro, and all these are the micro aspect, all the other kind of things, the way this embodied cognition, the way they have been talking about this kind of a consciousness. Therefore, therefore, Advaitins tries to reconcile uh, active, intentional consciousness with eternal and essential identity of consciousness and self by introducing a radical ontological distinction between the two levels of this. The first level is talk about the consciousness as the only reality. At the second level, talk about the consciousness of the world. You see, consciousness itself is the only reality and the consciousness of the world. You see, in Advaita, there is nothing called consciousness of the world, and consciousness of the world is a kind of illusory, you see. But in the Vishistadvaita, in the case of Vishistadvaita, you'll find the world is independent of consciousness. You see, the world is there is a difference between the world and consciousness, and this kind of things as if the world is, and consciousness itself, because everything is the manifestation of consciousness according to Advaita. And but according to Dvaitas, they make some kind of a dualism, and this kind of dualism, causal thesis, you will find also other embodied thesis of consciousness. Also. The Advaita view of consciousness is neither a property nor an act of self. You see, there is some kind of thesis which has been purported by many philosophers of mind recently spoke about there is some kind of property dualism, like H2O is equal to water. You see, the water and H2O, there is a difference only in the case of properties, otherwise there is no difference. Because some kind of a properties you will find in the water, like liquidity and solidity, you will not find same kind of a property in the uh, mm, H2O, two hydrogen molecules and one oxygen molecules. Therefore, this kind there is some kind of the difference in the sense of property. You see, although this the other things use of property is completely here is a kind of completely different, uh, because other the view of consciousness is neither a property nor an act of self, but rather it's a constant, ever present essence. If by essence as means a set of properties without which it cannot be what it is, consciousness cannot be the essence of the self. You see, the sense, you see, it is a itself is a consciousness. Therefore, you cannot say there are property about the consciousness. Therefore, there is saying that consciousness is the essence of the self. One mean that self is consciousness. You see, and they are two identical because you have to say identify the both the things. Therefore, the self luminosity is the defining property of consciousness. It is a self. It is self luminosity is a defining property of the consciousness. It is not that consciousness will be some other way, some medium. Reflects itself. You see, it's not that some medium is not necessary or some embodied way. We cannot say that consciousness. I am not denying that the embodied way of whenever we have a cognitive faculties, we need some kind of embodied kind of things, these kind of things, and this kind of embodied consciousness is a kind of a kind of a kind of a micro way of knowing about consciousness. There is a when I can say there is a micro consciousness. It but consciousness in essence is a macro. You see, and under the umbrella, if there is that consciousness, the transcendental consciousness is not there, this micro consciousness will not be there. You see, even if this micro consciousness uh, has no meaning in the world, also therefore very difficult to explain. Therefore, that self luminosity plays very vital role in the case of consciousness. You see, the other things hold that the self luminosity is the fitness of being immediately known uh, without being an object of any cognitions. This implies that consciousness is not intentional. It is not that because many times many philosophers they claim that the consciousness is intentional. Whenever I have a thought about something, and it stands for about stand to the world. You see, either it may be I may be dreaming or not dreaming or in the waking states or whatever the case may be. Therefore, this kind of there is some kind of fitness kind of things, one-to-one relationship. Although there are philosophers of language, they say that the mind and world they goes together. They have very much close cooperation between the mind and world, and therefore uh, uh, mind represent the world and both the things without the world, because mind cannot go beyond from this world. In that way, they try to say, but Here it is because of the consciousness, you see, and that plays very vital. Here the consciousness is not intentional. Why it is not intentional? Because of it is, it itself is self luminosity. Even it itself is intention. It is present itself. It is not that it is some mediums are there, it will be present. That is to say that it is not the conscious of or conscious for something. I am conscious of. I am conscious of these presentations. I am conscious of my system. One system picture tube is not working for me, or I am consciousness of something. It is a consciousness of or consciousness for this kind of analysis at there. And all this consciousness of, consciousness for, kind of embodied consciousness. So I would like to say this kind of embodied consciousness. And to be intentional, need to have an object. But pure consciousness is a kind of all contents has been subtracted. Therefore, intentionality is extreme to the. It is a kind of external factors for it. It is not intrinsic. It is not intrinsic to the consciousness. It is extrinsic, and therefore it is a kind of microwave. We can say it is a that consciousness is intentional, but not in the macro sense. You see. On the other hand, Advaitins claim that uh, consciousness only appears to be intentional on the account of a reflection of a sakara bruti. That what is that sakara bruti? You see, therefore this self-reflection sakara bruti. You see, the Advaita theory of consciousness has been able to accommodate two competing theories by assuming them two different levels of consciousness. The first one is pure consciousness, which is non-intentional. The second one is bruti, which is intentional. The second one weighs the causal influence of the world. Here we can say there is some kind of a embodied consciousness is going on in the case of bruti. You see, and therefore this embodied consciousness is there. The uh, uh, therefore this uh, this sakara and this bruti, this kind of two levels way of explaining. You see, the here the second one committing some kind of a causal influence on the object, the intentional structure and the causal story joined together in the second level. As we know that other things which they claim that aspect of consciousness, consciousness and being are identical. This is because of the fact that consciousness itself is the sources of being, that for which any entities derive their being. If you want distinguish between being and being, then Advaita being is conscious while all other objects are entities. You see, therefore, Advaita makes some kind of a so this Advaita theory of consciousness unconditional rejects any kind of reduction to material object, because there's you see, you cannot uh, talk about this consciousness some kind of a kind of embodied thesis of consciousness, and this embodied consciousness very difficult to talk about this one. It is also reject any possible account of causal origin of consciousness. There is no causal origin. There is no cause actually. It's because consciousness itself it existing actually. You see, there is no causal. But it doesn't object to reducing the mind to the matter. We can reduce to the mind to the matter and other kind of factor. But though it keeps consciousness ontological distinct, remain outside the purview of the consciousness, without which no brain state or some kind of some kind of embodied cognitions can able to know about or embodied consciousness can create this kind of a consciousness. In this respect, the Advaita thesis must be taken seriously, because many criticism may put forward by many physicists or and scientists, and the claim is that consciousness is an epiphenomena, or as an something that has no ontological status. If you will see consciousness from the Advaita perspective, it will give better picture than any kind of this embodied consciousness perspective investigations, embodied perspective of investigations. Many philosophers, also scientists, they follow non-reductionistic approach to the. They like non-embodied theory of consciousness, this non-embodied theory of consciousness, and speculation that consciousness is to be explained, uh, 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 even if they claim that this uh, ultimately, because they claim that ultimately there is some kind of a there may be some kind of biological explanation or biology way we can talk about this kind of thesis if it is not possible in this way. But there are neo Vedantins, the new way of interpreting Vedantin, especially uh, Sri Aurobindo, who talk about consciousness, and his idea of consciousness also is not embodied consciousness, and because which is a kind of a causal explanation, as I have been telling. Uh, but this new Advaitins have maintained that the evolution of nature leads to the manifestation of a human consciousness only because consciousness was already implicit in the material nature. It is there even if all objects, as you know, Vedantins say, everything is consciousness. With there's a degrees of consciousness are existing, therefore the consciousness plays very vital. We cannot make there's some kind of consciousness. In the case of embodied consciousness, you may find some kind of consciousness, you see. But in the case of the New Vedantins also they claim that there is some kind of a degree of consciousness. Even if in the matter also there is a degree of consciousness which is existing. This position would be compatible to Advaita view of things. The Advaita perspective need to uh, deny any kind of embodied theory of consciousness because it do not allow the embodied theory of consciousness is the only promising interpretations of science. We see this Advaita view of consciousness will not allow that this is the only promising view about talk about this kind of thesis. Therefore, the Advaitins would claim that taking all the facts into account that uh, not only this embodied thesis about the consciousness but also the fact of the higher reaches of consciousness. This is because of the fact that Advaitins accept they because they interpret universal interpretation of consciousness, that universal UIC UIC. This universal interpretation of consciousness plays very vital role in the case of Advaitins. Therefore, the Advaita Vedanta, they theorized about consciousness, which is under specific conditions of the human body becomes conscious. You see, if the human body is not become conscious, then it is as much as a kind of a body. You see, and and they no doubt began with human consciousness, but proceed to find its signs of its origin, source, true essence, which is none other than the universal or pervasive and consciousness. Therefore, the ontology, this transcendental, this metaphysical consciousness plays a very vital role to explain the human nature, but not the throw away the embodied consciousness. Or right now, with the hell keeping the idea of uh, uh, inactivism, uh, like the consciousness is environmental. Actually, it is we see that even if whenever we say that the consciousness is environmental, it is also intentional, and it is also kind of a naturalistic intentionality. Also, some kind of thesis which is there in this thesis. Therefore, this kind of idea is very difficult to accept. Therefore, the ontology of consciousness plays a very vital role in order to explain human nature, but this fact is completely missing in the case of embodied theory of consciousness. And Adityan may say that if there is no consciousness, there is nothing called nature, because nature is an appearance of the consciousness. Nature is an appearance of consciousness. Therefore, nature, it is not that nature is different from the consciousness. Therefore, we cannot misinterpret that or interpret consciousness in the embodied sense. And again, this embodied thesis is talking about some kind of inactive idea about the inactive idea about the consciousness. And although they talk about embodied cognitions, and within that embodied cognitions, they the the concept of consciousness plays very vital role, and that idea uh, completely missing in the uh, in the uh, mm, in the embodied theory of consciousness. This paper I am writing on this paper, and I would like to interpret from the neo, especially Aurobindo perspective. That part I have not uh, finished yet. Uh, this is a working paper, and I hope this paper, when I'll develop, I'm able to publish somewhere else. Uh, because the embodied theory of consciousness right now, many people are working on this, even if Andy Clark and many other Western scholars, including Indian scholars, many also, they give some kind of a cognitive perspective about the consciousness. And this cognitive perspective consciousness, if you accept the cognitive perspective consciousness, then you have to see that consciousness is a kind of a deterministic and under the umbrella of the natural sciences. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Nath, for your nice presentation.
Yeah.
And now session is open for the question from the audience.
I cannot read because my this picture too is not working. I cannot
Yes.
read any questions from a chat box.
Okay, I will
Please.
read that question.
Yeah,
Okay.
please. Yeah, yeah.
Is there any question? Okay. If there is no question, then we can proceed for our next talk.
Thank you very much.
Thank you,
One thing I
Doctor.
would like to
Yes, yes,
request.
Doctor. Yes, yes, Maharaj, please.
Sir, you spoke mostly about embodied consciousness
Yeah, yeah,
and then about consciousness without the attributes,
yeah, yeah,
which is I think, thesis given by followers of Advaita conception.
yeah, yeah,
But mm, in the Ramanuja conception, it is mentioned Vishishta, that means there is a unity in distinction.
yeah, yeah,
So, so it seems that in the Advaita conception, the idea of consciousness is very static.
yeah,
But
yeah,
in the idea of Ramanuja and further, like Lord Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, Achintya Vedaved, it does not say that the differences or the distinction is uh, not real. It says that distinction is uh, existing for the purpose of the original whole or organic whole.
yeah.
So, don't you think this question of embodied consciousness and the pure consciousness can be taken at a different dynamicity when we approach from other point of views?
Yes, thank you very much. Actually, in the case of, we have to see there is a distinction between Vishistadvaita view of consciousness and the Advaita view. In the case of Vishistadvaita, uh, the world is independent of world is independent of the of consciousness. But if the world is independent of consciousness, means the world is different from consciousness. Actually, independent. That means, you see. But according to but according to Advaita, there is nothing called consciousness of the world, because the world is a kind of illusion. Why they say that illusion? Because everything is appearance of the consciousness. Without consciousness, you cannot say that the world is there or anything else is there. If I am not the pure consciousness is not there, I cannot say there about. I cannot talk about the world. You see, the world is dependent on consciousness, but the consciousness
Yes.
is not dependent on the world. You see, that is a pure consciousness, and in that, this kind of things, if you see the, if it is, if the world is independent, then you are welcoming this embodied theory of consciousness. You see, this embodied theory of cognitive way to talk about consciousness, where there will be no pure consciousness, and again the consciousness will be completely intentional. It is a kind of worldly. You see, in the sense of the if it is a worldly, then the causality begins, and the causality then it is a kind of a causal theory of consciousness. Then in the case of what Advaitins they talk about, it is not pure consciousness is free from this. Although we talk about the causal, they are not denying that there is no causality, because when they talk about that sakara bruti, as I told you, the bruti modification happens in that time. You may say that there is some kind of a causality is there, because in the two levels, you see, in the first level the pure consciousness, in the second level it may you may talk about the bruti. When the modification happens, you can say the world, but that the bruti is dependent on the pure consciousness. That plays very vital role. In that sense, there is a distinction between both Advaita and Vishistadvaita views of consciousness. But I argue for Vishistadvaita view of consciousness, because everything else is appear as a consciousness. Because if I am not conscious, then how can I know the world? You see, for me, world is a kind of a nothing actually. You see, if I don't have consciousness, therefore consciousness is the primary, and anything else is in the secondary. Yes.
Yes. Actually, the terminology that is
Yeah.
there, they use the
Mm.
word Chit Surya, means the original
Yes.
sun, compare it with the original, original stage of consciousness, Chit Surya, and
Right.
Chit Kan, which means the
Yes.
sun disk and the sun rays. So,
Yes.
the, so this Chit Kan is not different from the Chit Surya because it is part and parcel of that, organically connect, like dependent. Uh, but the thing is, in the Advaitin position, this differentiation is something like a illusion for them. But in the Vishistadvaita and other views like Mahaprabhu's view, this is in what to say a process of a self-determination of the Chit Shakti. That means the Chit Shakti can determine itself to be both integrated and also self-differentiated. So it is not
Yeah.
a actual imposition on the consciousness, but it is its own activity.
That I accept that, because it is because of that I said it is a self luminosity.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Nath, for your wonderful explanation. And Dr. Bhaktivedanta Maharaj, thank you for your nice question.